As of recently, there seems to be a lot of historical figures that have been discovered to be gay. Alexander the Great was apparently gay. I mean, that's how he was portrayed in the Netflix adaptation. There are also claims that William Shakespeare and Abraham Lincoln were also gay. There may be some truth to these claims, but most of these gay revisionist historians aren't all that excited to try and claim this one guy. You know who I'm talking about. It's in the title. Adolf Hitler. Can't say I blame them. No one wants to have their movement associated with Hitler, but the evidence for Hitler's homosexuality is quite oppressing, even if most mainstream sources say it's just a rumor. Mostly because there isn't any 100% concrete evidence. But there is more evidence of his homosexuality than there is of most other historical figures who were supposedly gay. This may sound like a crazy claim. You might be saying, but, homophobia was an explicit policy of the Third Reich. What, was Hitler a hypocrite or something? Someone as noble as Hitler could never be a two-faced liar. But over the course of this series, you will find out how his probable homosexuality influenced his homophobic policies. Also, disclaimer, I'm not just going to talk about Hitler's homosexuality. In later parts, I'm also going to be talking about the influence of other gay leaders within the Third Reich's leadership as well. Some may construed that I'm saying modern gay rights movements like the LGBT are connected with Hitler's Germany, which is ridiculous. The way gay men in the movement viewed it was very much different from the modern view. Hitler was a vegetarian, but that doesn't have anything to do whether it's a good or bad movement. The same is true of homosexuality. But the role homosexuality played in the National Socialist movement can't be denied, especially in its early days. Okay, one more disclaimer. I'm going to use the term National Socialist more than Nazi because, YouTube doesn't like that word. So don't get confused when I use that term. They pretty much mean the same thing. Most Hitler books usually focus on his politics or historical influence. His life before politics is often seen as a minor detail compared to the time he was in power. And what he did in private is more seen as a fun fact, like Hitler loving movies and cars. But it's not uncommon for people to say Hitler had no personality and was purely a political being. One of the most respected Hitler historians, Ian Kershaw, said, outside politics, Hitler's life was largely a void, and states that anyone trying to document Hitler is to focus not upon the personality of Hitler, but upon the character of his power. Aside from this being a subjective statement, as brilliant as Kershaw was, he didn't write a Hitler biography. He wrote more about the socio-historical significance of Hitler, and his biography didn't divulge anything new about Hitler as a person. Kershaw failed to blend Hitler's private and public worlds together. Having the charisma to get a country to elect him as dictator is not befitting of someone who had no personality. Ever since Kershaw's biography was published in 1998, it is regarded as the end-all be-all of Hitler books. When you look up best Hitler biography, this is literally the first one to come up. And with this, Hitler is now viewed as the weird paradox of a man with the charisma of an unperson without an inner core. I mean, it's a great book. It's just not really a Hitler biography. It's definitely easier to view Hitler as a purely political being because his politics are the easiest to see because of the horrors they caused. But his personal life, the 30 years of existence he had before he became a politician, may shed some light on who he really was. What was his environment, his behavior, his emotional life, and how he tried to find what everyone wants: happiness. For Hitler, very little of that came from relations with women or family. So what gave his life meaning before he got into politics? In an attempt to find this out, I'll be required to humanize him. Some people may mistake this as an apologetic work, but Hitler was a human and had human problems and desires. But this is by no means trying to say that Hitler was misunderstood or that he wasn't at fault for his crimes. Hitler is one of the de facto meanie heads of history, and I am by no means trying to defend him. Oh, and for my sources, I'll put a lot of them on screen, but if you want to do a more thorough fact check, consult the book The Hidden Hitler by Lothar Macthane, which is where I got most of the information for this video. If you really want to, you can have the fun job of fact checking his 100 pages of citations. Although I believe the first piece of evidence I'm presenting is on the weaker side, I want to start in chronological order. But regardless, it's still very revealing, especially when taken in context of information in later parts of the video. What we know about Hitler's early life is fuzzy. We do know he wanted to be an artist, but he failed in that endeavor, and seemed to wander aimlessly until he became a politician years later. But there's a bit more to his early life than that. Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, and in 1903, Hitler's widowed mom moved to a new town with her sister and her children. Hitler attended a junior high school and had poor grades. He dropped out of school and returned to live with his family, but soon after his return home, his mom died. He then met an apprentice decorator named August Kubizek, whom we got some very interesting insights about Hitler from. The information comes from his book, The Young Hitler I Knew. The intimacy they had was far from typical. The way Kubizek writes about the relationship made them sound more like lovers than mere close friends. Both were infatuated with theater and opera, and would take long walks together in charming rural towns. Hitler was the more egocentric personality who always had grand visions, and Kubizek was content with the role of patient listener. Kubizek said he was intelligent and imaginative, but also erratic and impulsive. In the book, Kubizek always compared himself as his intellectual inferior. Many people look back and say this relationship was one-sided, and that he was just a receptacle for Hitler's flow of words. But the relationship seemed mutually reciprocal. They both very much saw each other's company. Kubizek speaks of true affection, mutual understanding, and great empathy. He said, "My friendship with Adolf Hitler bore from the outset the stamp of the unusual." Even though he always stuck to his own point of view, Kubizek said Hitler could also be so considerate that sometimes he made me feel quite ashamed. Kubizek described their closeness as, "By God, nobody on earth, not even my mother, who loved me so much and knew me so well, was as capable of bringing my secret aspirations into the open and making them come true as my friend." Hitler was seething with jealousy when Kubizek interacted with others. Hitler told Kubizek, "I can't bear it that you should mix with other young people and talk to them. This was an exclusive relationship. He would never have tolerated my having any interest in other people. As always, our friendship had to be utterly exclusive of all other interests." To me, that sounds more like a love affair than a friendship. Friendships aren't mutually exclusive. Even the best of friends usually have other people they hang out with. A romantic relationship is a purely exclusive one. When they lived in Linz, they used to buy lottery tickets in hopes of winning it big so they could be a pair of affluent artists living in the Austrian capital. They dreamed of buying a house together, and Hitler already had a decor picked out for it. An idea that particularly delighted Kubizek is when Hitler suggested that they dressed the same so people would think they were brothers. Outwardly, they wanted to appear as a couple. They would go on long excursions to streams and go swimming. And on their longer hikes, they would stay the night together, which they did often. And one of their goals was a long trip to Bayreuth. And Bayreuth was a known spot for homosexuals since it had a booming gay subculture. They were both huge fans of Richard Wagner's music, and it played an important role in their relationship. But it was well known at the time, Wagner's music had a cult-like following among homosexuals. I mean, lots of straight people liked him too, don't get me wrong, but people at the time realized, for whatever reason, gay men were especially attracted to his music. Hitler found other people repulsive, but Hitler took Kubizek's hand many times and is described in great detail. In their happy reunion at Vienna's Westbahnhof in 1908, Kubizek describes in an earlier version of his memoirs, "My friend, who was already awaiting me on the platform, greeted me in joyful excitement with a kiss and took me straight to his lodgings, where I myself was to spend the first night." I think this story best summarizes their relationship. Kubizek and Hitler were roaming through the mountains when suddenly a violent rainstorm showed up. They got soaked, but they found an old barn to take refuge in. Kubizek was worried because Hitler was really vulnerable to illness, so he made him get naked and forced him to lay in some linen sheets he found in the barn. He wrapped him up tightly and put another layer on him. Kubizek then wrung out his clothes and hung them up and then wrapped himself in one of the sheets. He eventually added some hay on both their bales to make sure they didn't get cold. They heard a dog barking in the distance, so he knew other people were around in the worst case scenario, but Hitler didn't care. he only liked Kubizek, since other people were repulsive to him. When Hitler awoke, he stood in the doorway, still naked, and threw the linen over his shoulder like a toga. I think Kubizek and Hitler had a relationship that goes beyond a platonic friendship. Their tender concern for each other's welfare, physical proximity, erotic attraction, and the desire for secluded togetherness. Kubizek, whether consciously or unconsciously, told the story of a romantic love affair. We don't know how far they went in their relationship. Kubizek published this in the 50s, so he couldn't just come out as gay without ruining his reputation. He had a wife and kids at this point. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but did Kubizek mention any relationships with women? Nope, nothing physical. Hitler supposedly liked this girl named Stephanie, but when it didn't work out, Kubizek said after the experience with Stephanie, he was now a woman hater. But there's doubt to whether she was real. Kubizek probably wanted to make Hitler seem capable of loving a woman, to make Hitler look better. He was loyal to the end. Even after all of Hitler's crimes were exposed, he still defended him. He talks about their supposed romance in great detail, but its arbitrary long-windedness makes it seem fake. Supposedly, she was everything to Hitler. He described her as the only person in God's earth extraneous to abominable humanity, a creature who, transfigured by radiant love, had imparted meaning and content to his tormented existence, sense, and purpose. This seems like a projection Kubizek uses to relativize him and Hitler's relationship. And to top off why Stephanie was probably fake, Hitler made no attempt to be with his beloved, which seems out of character. Hitler liked very few things, and the few things he did like, he pursued voraciously. Kubizek also mentions that women were very attracted to Hitler, but Hitler intentionally avoided women. My friend lived in self-imposed asceticism regarding girls and women. One day, when Kubizek was showing a pretty girl his music, Adolf came into the room and said nothing, but hardly had the girl go outside, then he went for me wildly. Kubizek said, I had a job to convince him that the girl was not suffering from the pangs of love, but from examination pains. The result was a detailed speech about the senselessness of women studying. It would make sense that Hitler, being the pompous, misogynistic artist type that he was, if he saw art and scientific skill as the most attractive traits in people, and him thinking all women as incapable of art or science, he wouldn't be attracted to any of them. Kubizek and Hitler spent only 4 months together in Vienna before going their own ways. According to Kubizek, it was because he did his military service after spending the summer in Linz with his parents and did not return to Vienna until 1908. By then, Hitler disappeared without a trace. But Kubizek was not old enough yet and would have done his military service in 1909, not 1908. And it's weird that after the August of 1908, they didn't contact each other again until 1933, 25 years later. Why would such close friends go so long without contacting each other? Why the secrecy? Who knows? But at the end of their time together, their relationship steadily deteriorated. Kubizek felt like an improper interloper since Hitler got really into politics, and Kubizek didn't really care about politics. Also, Hitler started roaming the city by himself, and would be gone for days at a time, which started to put a strain on their relationship. In September of 1909, after leaving his apartment, Hitler disappeared for 5 months. We're not sure where he was or what he did, but it's commonly suggested that he was homeless. But after 5 months off the radar, he turned up on the Hostel on Meldemannstraße. It was no secret during the early 1900s that municipal hostels for homeless men were hubs of homosexual activity. Some occupants participated in it because of their lack of contact with women, some did it because they liked it, and some did it for financial reasons. Hitler spent 3 years in this environment. The Hostel on Meldemannstraße was a somewhat luxurious lodging that was exclusively for men. About 70% of its occupants were under 35, and it had a low turnover rate. Reinhold Heinisch met Hitler here, and we got some good info from him. But who was this Heinisch guy? He was 25 when he first came to the hostel in 1909 and said he worked as a manservant in Berlin before he got there, whatever that means, and he went to prison for theft at one point. We don't know how much time he spent at Meldemannstraße, but we do know that he got to know Hitler during the winter of 1909 to 1910. He was probably there longer, but he checked in under fake names a lot, but not always, so we do know where he was at a few points. But we do know for sure that him and Hitler were close during the early 1910s. Okay, flash forward 20 years to the 30s, and Hainisch tried to make money off his former friendship with Hitler, and it didn't work very well. He was arrested twice for trying to forge fake Hitler paintings, but he did have some real ones. But after the arrest, Hitler instructed someone to confiscate everything. Hainisch was later in more serious trouble for collaborating with people critical of Hitler, such as Konrad Haydn, when he was on trial. In 1936, he was arrested again, allegedly because of more fake Hitler works. But most likely, the arrest took place because of the 2 manuscripts he had that no longer exist that detailed the time he spent with Hitler. A few weeks after his arrest, at age 33, he supposedly died of a heart attack in jail. Hainisch had been dead for 2 years when American publisher The New Republic magazine published I Was Hitler's Buddy. No one knows how the manuscript got to America, or what the original publication was based on, but it's about Hainisch telling us how he got to know Hitler at the Hostel for the Homeless. Hainisch said that Hitler was anything but a loner. He said he made friends with ease and had a big social group. He also talks about Hitler being completely broke, and how they did various odd jobs to make ends meet. They also founded their own firm, in which they supposedly sold Hitler paintings together. He also talks about Hitler's personal philosophy, political role models, and his view towards women. He notes how eccentric but unreliable Hitler was, but he still considered him a good friend. So far, the evidence does not point to Hitler being a big old gay boy yet, but we'll get there. Hainisch was already at home in this very gay environment, and I'm sure his questionable past job as a manservant helped with this. Hainisch said they were close friends and knew everything about each other, and this was confirmed by a fellow member of the hostel named Karl Liedenroth, who worked with Hainisch during the early 30s. Liedenroth said they were on very close terms. So Hainisch must have been pretty upset when a guy named Joseph Neumann replaced him as Hitler's picture-selling partner. Neumann was 31 years old in 1910. He was an unmarried laborer and a second-hand dealer. He was registered at the Meldemannstraße from January to July of 1910. Hainisch said that Neumann was a businessman by profession and didn't shrink away from any work, and was also described as a real friend of Hitler. One time in June, they checked out of the hostel for nearly a week. This was the only record of Hitler leaving the hostel, and he left with only 20 crowns in his pocket, which was very little money. We are told they went sightseeing in Vienna and spent most of the time at the museum, but that's unlikely. Really, spending a week at a museum seems scarcely credible. According to sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, someone who personally studied this stuff at the time, overnight hostels were hotbeds of male prostitution. Many people who stayed at the Meldemannstraße were in desperate need of money, including Hitler. In the spring of 1911, Hitler supposedly made money from selling postcards and other artworks, but this is doubtful. Based on Kubizek and Hainisch's statements, it seems unlikely that Hitler was capable of such concentrated and focused work. And even if he was that dedicated, making decent money as an artist in this environment was next to impossible. But according to many of his contemporaries, like Karl Hainisch, a fellow member of the hostel, Hitler seemed better off financially than most other hostel members. He went from broke to comfortable in about a year. So where did the money come from? Prostitution. Hitler likely whored himself out for money. We don't know this for sure, but rumors of Hitler's past from credible people make it seem much more plausible. According to Ernst Hafstengel, one of Hitler's closest friends, told the Secret Service in 1942 that the hostel Hitler stayed at was well known to be a place where elderly men went in search of young men for homosexual pleasures. It is probable that these types of old ruse and young gigolos became familiar to the young Adolf at this time. And another suspicious instance is when the Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, had given some incriminating material relating to Hitler's time in Vienna. It is reported that he brought this file to his friend and ally Benito Mussolini in 1934. Dollfuss was assassinated a month after giving Mussolini the report. After the assassination, the Italian state press said that the National Socialist leaders were murderers and homosexuals. Hitler's time at the hostel was almost over. He soon met Rudolf Hostler, a man who was regarded as the black sheep of his family and was kicked out to the streets when he was 18. We don't know where they met, but we do know that Hostler joined Hitler at the Meldemannstraße in February of 1913. They both bonded over their love of opera, specifically Wagner, and like Kubizek, took the role of the contented listener in the relationship. Hostler was eventually convinced by Hitler that they should move to Munich and share a room together. A lot of the information we have about Hostler comes from his daughter, Marianne Koppler. She was actually directly asked by historian Brigitte Hamann if her dad and Hitler had a homosexual relationship. Koppler said he made no allusions to anything more than a friendly relationship. But she also said she knows on the other hand that he would never have told her such a thing. So the question if they were a couple at one point remains unanswered, but it's hard to miss the parallels this relationship has with August Kubizek. They both had middle-lower class backgrounds, they both had jointly fused plans for the future, their fresh start in another city, and Hostler having a similar personality to Kubizek. Hostler's malleable character gave Hitler another chance to try what had failed with Kubizek. Hence, Hitler, aged 24, moved with 19-year-old Hostler to Munich. But why did they move to Munich instead of another place? Why not go back to Vienna or some other city? A contemporary viewer of Munich at the time wrote that it was a regular El Dorado for homosexuals. They settled in the Schwabing district. Schwabing at the time was considered a place that had a mass settlement of oddballs. Everyone of every type lived here. Painters, sculptors, models, philosophers, revolutionaries, sexual moralists, musicians, craftswomen, religious people, industrious people, and lazy people. It was a place that had less enforcement of any kind of social standard, and therefore was more accepting of just about everything, including homosexuality. So it's not hard to see why a place like this would attract Hitler. But the problem he always had popped up again. He failed to make it as an artist. Although his landlady, Anna Popp, said Hitler worked sun up to sundown selling his art to pay the bills, that's highly unlikely. Artists in the area, much more skilled than Hitler, said it to be impossible to make it financially there. And plus, Anna Popp was probably being told what to say in the interview. Plus, Hitler wasn't the type to work sun up to sundown on anything. So it's surprising he was able to come up with an annual income of 1,200 Reichsmarks when he was competing against thousands of other painters. We have testimony of Hitler struggling to sell his art at a beer garden. A man named Dr. Schirmer saw Hitler, who he described as a very shabby-looking man, going from table to table trying to make a sale. It must have been around 10 o'clock at night when I noticed him again, and saw that he still hadn't sold his picture. When he passed near me soon afterward, I asked him, being touched by his predicament from a purely human standpoint, whether he would be willing to sell the picture. They agreed to a price, although Dr. Schirmer didn't have enough money on him to pay it in full, and Hitler agreed to call him the next morning. They talked again, and Hitler offered to paint him more pictures. The doctor stated that although my own financial situation wasn't easy at the time, he agreed, and Hitler delivered all the promised works within a week. Schirmer again sensed that he was having a hard time of it, but he was also too proud to accept charity. On the other hand, he seemed to have realized that I wasn't a wealthy man, and I think that was why he never called again. Hitler yet again was having financial problems and struggling to sell his art, but he was eventually able to earn 1,200 Reichsmarks a year. Could Hitler have been prostituting himself here too? We'll probably never know. Hitler always wanted to be a part of the affluent bohemian lifestyle and tried to become acquainted with those higher up in the circle. And for the most part, he failed in this endeavor. He did have good relations with a man named Dr. Schnell. We're not sure of the extent of this relationship, but they were very close. He bought some of Hitler's art, purchased opera tickets for him, and invited him to his house many times. But there's an even more suspicious figure, a semi-high-up figure in the Bohemian Circle, the mythologist named Alfred Scholler. He was called an erotic advocate of the swastika and had no qualms practicing homosexuality. It's reported while seeking gay contacts in Schwabing to have come across a young man named Adolf. Among other things, Alfred Scholler had an anti-Semitic esoteric worldview and proclaimed the advent of a new era in a racial dystopia. Hitler sought him out and was no doubt influenced by this guy, since he did, on several occasions, look for ideological enlightenment from him in Vienna. So, it's possible that the gay contact he was looking for was Adolf Hitler, since he for sure knew him. After 9 months of living with Hitler, Hosler decided to move out, because Hitler was quick to anger, held grudges, and was a know-it-all yapper. This failed relationship and the outbreak of World War I changed Hitler's priorities from becoming an affluent bohemian to becoming a soldier. Hans Mend was a soldier who served with Hitler in the war, and unlike Kubizek and most others that hint at Hitler's homosexuality, he was not afraid to be blunt. Most people who knew about Hitler's gayness were gay themselves, and since it was still very much stigmatized at the time, it would have hurt their reputations just as much as Hitler's. Hans Mend is one of the only witnesses who is explicit about Hitler's private life. In September of 1948, a German diplomat named Werner Otto von Henteg received a letter from London, which contained a Hitler document, and we didn't know the content of this letter until 4 decades later. What was inside? It was the Mend Protocol. The Mend Protocol played an important role in the German resistance movement against Hitler. People of high rank in the resistance movement found this to be very important for bringing down Hitler, and would use it for Hitler's trial if he ever got arrested. But, you know, Hitler took the easy way out, so they didn't get to use it. It's a transcript from a man named Hans Mend, who had an opportunity to get to know Hitler very well. Mend was a dispatch rider on the staff of the List Regiment, along with Hitler, where he got to know a lot about him, his personal characteristics, his quirks, his disposition, his foundationalist political views, and last but not least, his love of men. The Mend Protocol goes like this. Mend states that Hitler was physically unfit to serve in World War I, and was rejected after he volunteered for service in 1914. Since he was unemployed in Munich, he wanted to join the military, just so he could get consistent square meals because he was broke again. Since he was rejected, he stationed himself in front of the Wittelsbacher Palace at a time when King Ludwig usually left the building. He managed to stand in front of the king's path and convinced him to let him fight, and that's how Hitler was able to join the List Regiment. Hitler was never involved in actual combat, and he was nothing more than a runner. Every 2 or 3 days, he would deliver a message, and the rest of the time, he mostly did what he wanted. He painted, talked politics, had altercations with other military members, and was soon nicknamed Crazy Adolf. He would often fly into a rage if someone contradicted him, and would throw himself to the ground and froth at the mouth. Private Ernst Schmidt, someone who Hitler was friendly with because they sometimes worked on building sites together, became very close. Hitler was also friendly with a few others as well. He was even good friends with a Jewish combat soldier named Lippert, who Mend says at the time of writing this in 1939 was exempt from the anti-Jew laws and was a clerk at a Nazi headquarters. Hitler tended to an injured Colonel Engelhardt and made a big fuss about it to Lieutenant Huttman, who eventually promoted him to Iron Cross Second Class, and in 1918, he eventually got Iron Cross First Class. Mend says as the soldiers got to know him better, they noticed how he never looked at a woman, and suspected he was gay. They said he had very feminine characteristics, like never having firm beliefs. Okay, keep in mind, this was the 1910s, so the views on men and women were a bit different, so this on its own isn't much. But there's a bit more. One night, the soldiers were at the Lefebvre brewery at Fornes, and that night, everyone slept on some hay outside. But they noticed Hitler was bedded with Schmidt, who they called his male whore. Then, someone turned on their flashlight and mocked the two by saying, "Take a look at these two Nancy boys." After this, Mend says he took no further interest in Hitler's love life, but he couldn't escape Hitler's political tirades. He said he called himself a representative of the class-conscious proletariat, and wherever he thought he could, he called his superiors robber knights, highwaymen of the nobility, or a clique of bourgeoisie exploiters. After Mend completed his war service, he bumped into Hitler again in Munich, who was still with Schmidt. He said Hitler seemed pleased that many countries went into turmoil after World War I, and said, "Thank God the kings have toppled off their perch. Now, we proletarians also have a say." Hitler was at the time living at the hostel for homeless at 29 Lothstrasse. At one point, Mend allowed him to stay at his apartment for a few days. After that, he went to a military barracks because he was hungry. He was able to get in because of his Iron Cross first-class promotion and because he was a professional yapper, telling war stories and whatnot. Mend says it was indeed striking that Hitler, who served from the beginning to the end of the war, didn't get promoted any further. In early 1920, Mend heard Hitler became a public speaker, so he went to some of his speeches in secret. He said that Hitler's colors sure have changed. His political views were a lot different than what he was espousing to Mend when they were in the military. Hitler again stayed with Mend for a night or two. Hitler said he couldn't go home, and when Mend asked why, Hitler wouldn't tell him. After having contact with Hitler again and again after the war, Mend says it confirmed his thoughts on him. He said that Hitler was a book of 1,000 pages and was completely two-faced. He was hypocrisy personified. One of his faces was that of a self-important busybody, a face that came out in front of his superiors and, if need be, his comrades. He was a tattletale who would rat someone out if it benefited him. That is why everyone, including his comrades, were wary of him. Men described his second face as that of a secret, sinister criminal. He said his whole attitude was that of a ruthless person who knows how to wrap himself in a halo. He said he was a great actor and lied whenever he opened his mouth. Mend also says that he tried to get a senior position with the Communist Party, but the Munich Directorate of the Communists wouldn't give it to him, since a senior post would have exempted him from the need to work, which is what they thought his goal was. Even though he expressed his searing hatred of all property owners, they distrusted him. Eventually, he joined a right-wing paramilitary organization called the Freikorps Epp, because they trusted him since he had military experience. He quickly became a snake and accused people who were in a job he wanted of incompetence, and quickly took their spots until he finally became leader after he managed to take down the Drexler Party, who used to be in charge. Mend paints a pretty blunt picture of his experience with Hitler. Mend claims Hitler was a politically foundationless snake. And also, what's more relevant to this video is that he was having a sexual relationship with a man. But how trustworthy is Mend's account? Could he have just made up the whole thing? Well, it is officially attested that Mend did serve with Hitler, and it's officially attested that he knew him quite well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's telling the truth. So let's look at Mend's life. Mend was known for his bravery in World War I, and got the nickname Ghost Rider. After the war, Mend tried many ways to make money and get a career going, but that never panned out for him. After Hitler's rise to prominence, Mend reached out to him a few times, and Hitler eventually responded. And Mend probably reached out because he needed money. He still thought Hitler was a two-faced hypocrite, but if he can make some money from his old comrade's newfound fame, whatever. So Hans got in contact with him, and he published Adolf Hitler, I'm Filled, at the end of 1930. Which was an account of his war days with Hitler, and it was very clearly propaganda. Even the gullible Hitler fan knew the book was an exaggeration, but they needed at least some counter-propaganda, since some of Hitler's political enemies had dug up dirt on him, and found out that he wasn't the frontline war hero that he claimed he was in Mein Kampf. The book almost certainly had a ghostwriter. Mend was a simple farmer boy, and could barely string together a sentence at the time. But he and his ghostwriter did not completely stick to the script they were given. It mentioned some of Hitler's weird quirks, and even brought up his mega misogyny. Mend himself and Hitler's close friend, Max Mann, both said Hitler was extremely annoyed with the book, but he didn't do much about it because he thought it would be too risky to disown or punish Mend. As long as the media outlets that were still hostile to Hitler just viewed it as another piece of propaganda that presented him as a war hero, it was no biggie. In any case, the Volksschau recommended Mend's memoir as the finest Christmas gift for any supporter of Hitler. This boosted Mend's ego. He went from a broke nobody to a respected author in the span of a few months. But Hans was more of a latching parasite on Hitler, and not some sort of Machiavellian tactician, and couldn't hold on to his fame for long. Since Hitler was annoyed with the book, he gave Mend the cold shoulder, and Mend was offended by this. And newly emboldened by his newfound fame, he confronted Hitler at his usual cafe called Cafe Heck on October 8th, 1932, and made a big scene. It's reported that Mend said, "Listen, Adolf," he shouted, "why are you ignoring me? Have you forgotten your benefactor? To whose credit is it that you're here at all? We'll talk about that later, you half-man. You jumped up the knife grinder. You're going to get it in the neck from me tomorrow, in writing. I'm warning you. Adolf, don't tempt me." And this wasn't just talk. The next day, he started a scandal. Hitler's biggest journalistic opponent, Fritz Gerlich, published a Mend's letter to Hitler in the Der Gerade Weg. It's a pretty classic case of blackmail. He said he suppressed many details in the book, and if he were truthful, Hitler would not have come out as a hero. Mend ended it by saying he remembered what he used to be. A ballsy move for sure, but from a tactical standpoint, not the brightest move. By saying this, he started a war he could never win. It's unlikely that Mend exposing Hitler as gay would have done much damage. It would have been dismissed as a false claim by Hitler's ignoble enemies or something like that. Also, the National Socialists easily could have dug up dirt on Mend's not-so-noble past. Even though the anti-Hitler press was satisfied with his testimony, he was never offered to join them, so Mend was completely on his own against National Socialist backlash. At first, Hitler didn't do anything. He was still biding his time to deal with the matter. At the end of that November, Mend realized his situation and went on the defensive. In a press release dated December 1st, 1932, his tone gets a lot more subdued. He doesn't take back his original stance or anything, but he does say he came out publicly with the information because of Hitler's uncomradely behavior. He claimed he was mad at Hitler's entourage for keeping him from his friendship with Hitler, which Hitler assured him of in the letters they shared. He said he didn't deserve the backlash he got from his statement, because he selflessly supported and defended Adolf Hitler, his former wartime comrade, even at the risk of his own life. He doesn't talk anymore about deliberately suppressing evidence of Hitler's past or anything like that. He was on damage control. That was the gist of his press release. His weird apology took the pressure off Hitler, but Hitler still kept a close eye on Mend. In 1939, Mend said, "I felt like I was under constant observation after that," referring to his first expose. He received anonymous letters threatening him ever since he came out. But more than just letters were sent. About a month after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Mend said he was stormed at night on March 9th, 1933. His house was raided by people in party uniforms, who pointed their revolvers at him at all times. But a third man in civilian clothes was standing behind them and said, "Ghostwriter, you're coming with us." Mend says apparently Hitler didn't order the arrest, and only found out about it by chance, and ordered him to be set free after spending 3 months in solitary confinement. This tells us that the would-be blackmailer wasn't going to be executed just yet. As long as he pledged complete loyalty to Hitler, he would live, which he did. He sent a remorseful letter to the NSDAP and asked to be readmitted into the party. Even though he was in solitary for 3 months, Mend claimed he did this of his own will, and said he would now support Hitler no matter what. Mend also burned most of his incriminating evidence, probably on an order from the authorities. Even though Mend got readmitted back into the party, that didn't mean he could contact Hitler again. He was merely tolerated and placed under surveillance. After this, Mend had a few years of reprieve. He made money from various odd jobs, he published another book, and sold some authentic Hitler drawings and photographs to make it financially. We don't have them anymore, but according to witnesses, the photographs of Hitler he had were not only very unflattering, but also showed that he had some suspiciously intimate relationships with fellow soldiers. But for Mend's business, this was great. It showed his clients and everyone else that he really did have a pretty close relationship to Hitler during the war. This may have been good for business, but this was bad for the National Socialists. They wanted to get the photos back at all costs. In the summer of 1936, Mend was taken to court on a trivial charge. The judge, Trial District Judge Wells, was reported to have said, "Let's destroy him." We're not sure of the exact details because the court records have disappeared, maybe because what was uncovered was too dangerous. But Mend alleges that the Gestapo took advantage of Mend's absence to search his house and confiscate anything he had relating to Hitler. When Mend's attorney tried to get his stuff back, the Gestapo said they couldn't because of orders from higher up. There's a good chance that Hitler himself orchestrated this. The court case finished off with a criminal charge that would not only put him in prison, but would totally destroy his reputation. The charge was sexual offenses against children. He got 2.5 years of hard labor and a 3-year loss of civil rights. Mend denied these charges till his dying breath. I mean, maybe he did it, but one, the court records were destroyed, so looking at the evidence isn't gonna happen. 2, this was just too convenient for Hitler. Hitler had the power to bring false charges, so it's probable that they were totally fabricated. Framing enemies for totally false sexual offense charges was a common tactic used by the National Socialists. And 3, this was clearly a stacked trial if the judge said, "Let's destroy him." After serving in 2 concentration camps, he was released on Christmas Eve in 1938, but was kept on probation. After his release, he returned to Munich, but his reputation was totally destroyed. He was now just another disgusting sex offender. Whatever his motive was for publicly giving incriminating evidence to Hitler's political enemies, whether it was his hatred for Hitler, or him thinking Hitler would be overthrown soon, or the courage of a man with nothing to lose and was willing to take the consequences, Mend's statements and actions give a lot of credibility when set against this backdrop. After being persecuted by the National Socialists, he became more outspoken, not less. Dr. Herbert Paulus said later, after talking with Mend, that it all strengthened me in my opposition to the National Socialist system, because he never exaggerated. But at the time, more people were in favor of Hitler than were not, so it didn't do any damage to his reputation. Mend knew the police were looking for any reason to put him back in custody. In September of 1940, he was accused of slandering the Führer. The witness was a woman named Eva Koenig, and again, he was charged with sexual offenses, this time against adult women, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. And in February of 1942, he was announced dead, which is something he suspected would happen to him. When he wrote to his girlfriend from jail, "I can foresee my end. I've simply been in the world too long." Eva Koenig gives us some interesting things he said during his court case. We don't know if Mend brought this up or not, but one of the questions was, why did Hitler never get married? And Mend said he knew perfectly well why. He knew it wasn't because he had a malfunctioning wiener. He saw him naked before in the showers in the military, and it wasn't deformed or anything. He flatly said that Hitler wasn't interested in women. Mend shared a bunk below Hitler's, and constantly made remarks about Hitler's homosexual love. Mend did not shrink in court, and attacked Hitler in a very shameless manner. He said Hitler did all kinds of things with men at night. He also said other men smeared Hitler's weenie with boot polish while he slept, which was a common tactic they used to mock homosexuals on the front line. I'm gonna end part 1 here. I have 2 more videos planned for this series, but there's some things I want to clarify. Hitler being gay is a rumor that's been going around for a long time, and I wanted to bring up all the reasons why this rumor has spread, and if there's any legitimacy to it, which I think there is. But uncovering Hitler as being gay really changes some interpretations of the National Socialists. I'm not just trying to uncover some fun fact about Hitler, but it also explains some of the draconian policies he set in place against homosexuals, which sounds paradoxical, but I'll cover it, especially in part 3. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and bye-bye.